The gas station on the edge of Elkhart, Indiana, stayed quiet before sunrise, the kind of quiet that made small sounds feel louder than they were. Daniel Harper stood behind the counter with a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands, watching the digital clock crawl toward 5:30 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and tired, and the smell of fuel mixed with burnt coffee clung to the air. Daniel had worked this shift for years, early mornings, late nights, weekends when the town slept and the highway breathed. He knew the regulars by the sound of their footsteps, the way they reached for the same snacks, the coins they counted twice before paying. This morning felt ordinary, which was why he didn't notice the moment it changed. A man stepped inside, shoulders hunched, jacket too thin for the cold. He stood near the door longer than necessary, eyes scanning the shelves like he was searching for something he couldn't name. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet recognition of someone carrying more than they showed. He thought of his own apartment, second floor, peeling paint, rent due in 4 days, and the envelope waiting on his kitchen table. He thought of the call he'd ignored from his sister the night before, afraid of what she might ask. When the man finally approached the counter, his hands shook slightly as he placed a small bottle of water down. His card declined, once, then again. The register beeped, sharp and unforgiving. The man muttered an apology, already stepping back, embarrassment settling into his shoulders. Daniel knew that look. He'd worn it before. The rules were clear. Company policy was printed in bold behind the counter. No exceptions, no free items, no personal transactions. Daniel glanced at the sign, then at the man, then at the clock still crawling forward. He felt the choice forming quietly, without drama, without witnesses. He didn't know yet how much it would cost him, and the decision waiting there would not stay small for long. Daniel's life had narrowed over the years in ways he never planned. He grew up a few towns over, the oldest of 3, learning early how to make room for other people's needs. His father worked assembly lines that disappeared when factories closed, and his mother stretched paychecks with careful meals and second-hand coats. Daniel learned to be useful. Useful felt like safety. After high school, he took the first steady job he could find, telling himself it was temporary. Temporary became years. He moved into a small apartment near the highway, close enough to hear trucks pass at night, far enough to feel alone. He sent money to his sister when he could. He skipped doctor visits. He fixed things himself. When his hours were cut last winter, he took the overnight shifts without complaint, believing endurance counted for something. It didn't make him special, it made him tired. Still, he kept going. On slow nights, he cleaned the same counter twice, watched the same security monitor loop, and wondered when he stopped imagining a different life. The gas station was a place where people passed through, carrying pieces of themselves they didn't want to unpack. Daniel saw it all. The small kindnesses, the quiet desperation, the way shame arrived before words. He never judged. Judging required energy he didn't have. That morning, with the man standing a few feet away, Daniel felt all those years pressed together. He remembered nights when he'd eaten cereal for dinner, mornings when he'd chosen gas over groceries. He knew the rules existed for a reason, and he also knew how often reasons failed people. The man reached for the bottle, then stopped, like even touching it felt wrong. Daniel's coffee sat forgotten, steam gone. The clock ticked. He thought of his rent. He thought of the company camera above the register. He thought of how small help could be and how heavy it could feel. And the space between policy and people grew uncomfortably thin. Daniel cleared his throat and did something simple. He slid a few bills from his pocket onto the counter and tapped the register key himself. The beep sounded different this time, softer somehow. He handed the bottle across with a nod that asked for nothing in return. The man hesitated, eyes wide, then whispered, "Thank you," like it might break if said too loud. He left quickly, as if staying might make it real. The door closed. The The station returned to its hum. Daniel stood still, heart beating harder than the moment seemed to deserve. It was just water. It was just a few dollars. He told himself that. He finished the shift without incident, wiped the counter, locked the door when daylight finally spilled in. On the bus home, fatigue settled into his bones. He watched neighborhoods pass, small houses, empty driveways, flags hanging still. When he reached his apartment, the envelope waited where he'd left it. He opened it this time. The notice was polite but firm. Late fees would begin in 2 days. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed and did the math again, slower, hoping numbers might change if treated gently. They didn't. The money he'd given away wasn't the problem by itself, but it tipped something fragile. He skipped breakfast. He showered quickly, the water barely warm. By afternoon his phone buzzed. It was his sister calling again. He answered this time. She asked if he could help with a prescription for their mother. Daniel closed his eyes. He said he'd try. He meant it. He always did. When he hung up, the apartment felt smaller. The help he'd offered at the station replayed in his mind, not as pride, not as regret, just as fact. And facts have a way of adding up when you're not looking. 2 days later, Daniel returned to the gas station for another overnight shift, the sky low and grey. He clocked in, nodded to the manager heading out, and settled into the familiar rhythm. Around midnight, the same man from before came back. He didn't approach the counter right away. He picked up a sandwich, a coffee, then stopped. When he finally paid, he slid a few extra dollars across and said quietly, "For last time." Daniel shook his head and pushed the money back. The man insisted. Daniel insisted more gently. They stood there a moment, both unsure how to accept something without turning it into a transaction. Finally, the man left the bills on the counter and walked out, not waiting. Daniel stared at the money, then placed it in the register, marking it as an overage. Cameras watched. Policy was policy. Later that night, a woman came in with a child asleep against her shoulder. She asked for directions to a shelter, voice thin with exhaustion. Daniel printed a map, circled streets, handed it over. He didn't give money this time. He gave time. When the shift ended, his body ached. His phone showed a missed call from the landlord. He returned it. The conversation was brief, respectful, unmoving. An extension wasn't possible. Daniel thanked him anyway. On the bus home, dawn crept in again, pale and quiet. He realized something then, not as a lesson, not as a rule, but as a weight he would carry. Helping didn't end when it felt good. Sometimes it kept going, long after the cost arrived. And the cost was only beginning to show itself. The notice on Daniel's apartment door arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, folded once, taped carefully like it was trying not to offend him. He stood in the hallway longer than necessary, keys still in his hand, reading the words he already expected to see. Past due. Final reminder. He peeled the paper down and slipped it into his jacket pocket, as if hiding it might soften its meaning. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. He sat at the small table by the window and spread out everything he had: bank statements, handwritten notes, a list of shifts circled in pen. The numbers refused to cooperate. Helping had not ruined him, but it had removed his last margin. There was no extra left to lean on. That night, Daniel went to work anyway. The station felt colder, emptier. He rang up customers with the same calm tone, smiled when required, kept moving. Around 3 a.m., his manager texted asking if he could pick up an extra shift later in the week. Daniel typed yes before thinking. Sleep became optional. Hunger became manageable. The idea of stopping never crossed his mind. He wasn't angry at the man he'd helped. He wasn't proud either. He just accepted the reality that sometimes kindness didn't return immediately or at all. And the silence after helping can be louder than gratitude. By Thursday, exhaustion had settled deep. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he poured coffee, his thoughts moving slower than usual. During a lull, he stepped outside and leaned against the brick wall, breathing in the cold night air. Across the parking lot, headlights swept past without stopping. He thought about calling his sister to tell her he couldn't help this time. The words formed, then dissolved. Instead, he sent what little he could and hoped it would be enough. When he returned inside, a regular named Tom stood at the counter, a truck driver who came through twice a week. Tom noticed Daniel's tired eyes and asked if everything was okay. Daniel shrugged. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the truth either. Tom nodded like he understood more than was said and slid a coffee across the counter, already paid for. Daniel hesitated, then accepted it. The warmth felt heavier than the cup itself. He realized then how rare it was to be on the receiving end of quiet help. And accepting help can feel harder than giving it. The eviction date arrived with no ceremony. Daniel packed slowly, placing clothes into boxes he'd saved from work deliveries. He didn't tell anyone at the station. He didn't want sympathy. On his last night, he sat on the bare floor and listened to trucks pass, the sound that had once kept him company. He wasn't scared, just tired. The next morning, he loaded what he could into his car and drove toward his sister's place, 2 hours away. Pride stayed behind with the empty apartment. On the highway, he thought about how easily people judged cost without knowing what was paid. He remembered the man at the counter, the woman with the child. The coffee slid toward him without words. None of it felt wasted, and loss doesn't always mean regret. At his sister's house, Daniel slept on a couch that sagged in the middle. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe. He helped where he could: repairs, groceries, rides. He applied for jobs closer to her town, including one at a warehouse that ran night shifts. The interview was brief, honest. A week later, he started. The work was heavier, the hours longer, but the pay steadier. On his first paycheck, Daniel sat quietly and looked at the number, not with relief, but with resolve. Helping had cost him his apartment, his routine, his independence. But it hadn't taken his sense of who he was, and that would matter more than he knew. The warehouse sat just outside town, a long grey building surrounded by gravel and dim lights that stayed on through the night. Daniel learned the rhythm quickly: the hum of conveyor belts, the steady beeping of forklifts, the unspoken rule that everyone kept moving even when their bodies wanted to stop. He worked nights now, sleeping during the day on his sister's couch while sunlight filtered through thin curtains. It wasn't the life he imagined, but it was a life that worked. Each shift paid down a little more of what he owed, rebuilt a small piece of what he'd lost. Still, there were moments when fatigue crept in quietly, when his arms ached and his thoughts wandered back to the gas station, to the counter where one small choice had set everything else in motion. He didn't replay it with bitterness. He replayed it like a landmark, something that marked where he'd been. During breaks, he sat with co-workers who shared stories in fragments, missed birthdays, second jobs, hopes they didn't say out loud. Daniel listened more than he spoke. He realized how many people were carrying invisible costs, paying them slowly, silently. And listening began to feel like another way of helping. One morning, after a long shift, Daniel stopped at a diner near the highway. It was nearly empty, the kind of place that smelled like grease and coffee and felt untouched by time. He ordered eggs and toast, eating slowly while the waitress refilled his cup without asking. At the counter, a young man argued softly on his phone, frustration spilling out in half-sentences. Daniel recognized the sound of someone close to losing balance. When the man hung up and reached for his wallet, it slipped from his hand. Cards scattered across the floor. Daniel knelt to help, handing each one back carefully, meeting the man's eyes just long enough to say, "It gets heavy sometimes." The man nodded, swallowing hard. No thanks followed. None was needed. Daniel paid his bill and left, stepping into the early morning light feeling both tired and strangely grounded. Because helping had become part of how he moved through the world, weeks turned into months. Daniel saved enough to rent a small room of his own, a place with mismatched furniture and a window that faced an alley. It wasn't much, but it was his. On move-in night, he sat on the floor eating takeout, listening to the sounds of other lives through the walls. He thought about how easily he could have closed himself off after losing his apartment, how bitterness could have settled in quietly. It hadn't. Helping had cost him stability, yes, but it had also stripped away excuses. He no longer believed kindness was something you did when it was convenient. He understood it as something you carried, even when it weighed you down, and weight as a way of reshaping what you value. One evening, Daniel received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was the man from the gas station. He'd asked the cashier for Daniel's name weeks ago and finally tracked him down. The message was simple. He had found steady work, was doing better, and wanted Daniel to know that the water had mattered more than he could explain. Daniel read the message twice, then set the phone down. He didn't reply right away. He didn't need to. He sat on his bed, listening to traffic outside, and felt something settle inside him. Not pride, not triumph, just quiet confirmation. And the story was still moving forward. Life in the small rented room settled into a rhythm Daniel didn't rush to name. He worked nights at the warehouse, slept during the day, and spent his evenings doing ordinary things that felt newly earned, washing his clothes at the laundromat down the street, cooking simple meals, sitting by the window with the radio low. The room wasn't silent, just honest. He could hear arguments through the walls, laughter sometimes, televisions left on too late. It reminded him that stability didn't mean peace, it meant endurance. At work, he became reliable, not the fastest, not the strongest, but steady. When someone missed a shift, Daniel stayed. When someone struggled, he showed them shortcuts without making it feel like charity. His body hurt most days, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. The cost he paid no longer felt sharp. It felt absorbed, like something the ground eventually takes in after a storm. But endurance has a way of being tested again. The test came in the form of his mother's health. His sister called late one afternoon, her voice tight with worry. Their mother needed tests, then more tests. Insurance covered some of it, not all. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear, staring at the cracked paint near the window. He knew what his sister wasn't asking out loud. When the call ended, he opened his bank app and stared at the number he'd worked months to rebuild. Helping again would set him back. Not helping would sit heavier. He sent the money without announcing it, without framing it as sacrifice. Later that night, as he walked to work under orange streetlights, he felt the familiar tightening return. Not fear, not regret, just reality. And reality doesn't soften just because you understand it. At the warehouse, the night moved slowly. Daniel stacked boxes, scanned labels, kept his head down. During break, a co-worker named Luis mentioned needing a ride home after his car broke down. Daniel hesitated only a moment before offering. It meant less sleep, another small cost added quietly. They drove through empty streets, headlights cutting across shuttered shops. Luis talked about his kids, his worries, the way life kept asking for more than he had ready. Daniel listened, hands steady on the wheel. When he dropped Luis off, there was no thank you that felt big enough to mark the moment. Just a nod, just understanding. And understanding can be heavier than words. That weekend, Daniel visited his mother in the hospital. The room was small, clean, filled with the soft beeping of machines. She looked smaller than he remembered. They talked about ordinary things. Weather, neighbors, television shows, careful not to touch the worry sitting between them. As he stood to leave, she reached for his hand and held it longer than necessary. She didn't say she knew what he'd done. She didn't have to. Daniel drove back to his room in silence, realizing that helping didn't always fix things. Sometimes it just kept them from breaking all at once, and the cost of that choice was still unfolding. Winter arrived slowly, almost politely, the way it does in small American cities where the cold doesn't announce itself all at once. Daniel noticed it in the mornings first, his breath visible as he walked back from night shifts, the sidewalks stiff with frost. Heating bills climbed. His hours at the warehouse stayed the same. He layered clothes instead of turning the thermostat higher. At work, overtime was offered sparingly, and when it came, younger workers grabbed it fast. Daniel didn't compete. He had learned how quickly balance could tip. Some nights, exhaustion settled into his bones, and he wondered if the quiet choices he kept making were slowly emptying him. Not in a dramatic way, just thinning him out piece by piece, and being thinned out can feel invisible. One evening, Daniel stopped at a diner after work, the kind that never closed and never changed. Vinyl booths. Coffee that tasted burnt but honest. A waitress named Karen recognized him from late nights months before. She poured his coffee without asking. They talked lightly at first, weather, traffic, nothing heavy. Then she mentioned her hours getting cut, how tips weren't what they used to be. Daniel listened, nodding, not offering solutions. When he paid, he left more than usual, knowing it meant groceries would be tighter. Karen noticed, but didn't comment. She just smiled in a way that wasn't loud or grateful, just human. And small kindnesses leave quiet echoes. Back in his room, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the ledger of his life, what went out, what came in, what never seemed to balance. He wasn't angry, he wasn't proud, he was tired in a way sleep didn't touch. Still, when morning came, he got up. He washed his face. He went to work. The city moved around him, indifferent but consistent. On his walk home, he passed a man sleeping in a bus shelter, coat pulled tight, shoes worn thin. Daniel paused, then left his gloves beside the bench without waking him. And sometimes help is meant to go unnoticed. Days later, Daniel received a message from his sister. Their mother's test results were better than expected. Not perfect, but hopeful. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed again, phone in his hand, feeling something loosen in his chest. Relief didn't arrive like celebration. It arrived like breathing out after holding it too long. That night, as he walked to work, the cold felt less sharp. Not because winter had eased, but because something inside him had. He realized that even when help costs you, it can still give something back, quietly, without promises. But the final cost was still waiting to be understood. The warehouse felt different as the year leaned toward its end. Fewer orders, longer silences between machines starting up. Daniel noticed supervisors talking in low voices near the loading docks. A list went up one afternoon, names printed in plain black ink. Schedule changes. Temporary layoffs. His name wasn't there yet, but he didn't feel spared. He felt delayed. That night he worked slower, more carefully, as if attention itself could protect him. During break, he sat alone, scrolling through old photos on his phone. His mother before illness, his sister laughing at a cracked kitchen table, moments that existed without asking anything back. He realized how much of his life had become about holding things together quietly, without witnesses. And quiet endurance often goes unrewarded. A week later, the call finally came. Fewer shifts, indefinite. The supervisor sounded tired, apologetic, powerless. Daniel thanked him anyway. After hanging up, he sat in his room, listening to the building's old pipes knock and hiss. Fear didn't rush in. It arrived slowly, like a draft through a cracked window. He made a list: rent, food, bus fare, his mother's medication. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did he. Still, that evening, he returned a wallet he found on the sidewalk outside a grocery store, tracking down the owner 2 blocks away. The man tried to press cash into his hand. Daniel refused, because some lines, once crossed, never uncross. Weeks passed. Temporary became uncertain. Daniel took odd jobs, moving boxes, cleaning garages, helping neighbors without names. One afternoon, a woman knocked on his door. Karen from the diner. She said the gloves he left months ago had reached her nephew, the one sleeping rough. He had found work, a place to stay. She handed Daniel an envelope inside, a gift card and a note signed by several people, names he barely recognized. No speeches, no praise. Just acknowledgement. Daniel felt his throat tighten, not from pride, but from something softer. Being seen, even briefly, changed the weight of things, and being seen can steady a tired soul. Spring came back the same way winter had left, quietly. Daniel found steady work again, nothing impressive, just enough. His mother improved. His sister slept better. Life didn't transform, it adjusted. Sometimes Daniel still thought about the cost of helping, the nights he chose others over ease. He didn't romanticize it. He understood now that doing the right thing doesn't protect you from loss. It just means you don't lose yourself at the same time. In a world that rarely pauses to notice, that felt like enough, and sometimes enough is everything.